Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why so many more men end up in prison than women? It is a gap that is huge everywhere in the world and has been for a long time. Does it just mean men are naturally more prone to committing crimes? That is the big question that Marie Hamatschek and Jesko Niggemann set out to explore in their fascinating study. They looked at personality traits that are often linked to crime and wondered if these traits explain why men are locked up at such much higher rates than women. Their main idea, which they call the equal selection model, is pretty simple. It suggests that if a personality trait leads to crime, it should affect both men and women the same way. Imagine a line, and if you cross that line, you are likely to end up in prison. The equal selection model says that line should be at the same spot for both men and women. So for a personality trait to explain the gender gap, three things would need to be true according to this model. First, this means generally, even before anyone is in prison, men would score higher on these crime-linked traits than women. Second, people in prison, both men and women, should score higher on these traits than people not in prison. This shows the trait is a factor in going to jail. And third, and this is the key part for explaining the gap, basically the men and women who are in prison should look pretty similar in terms of these personality traits. If these three things are true for a trait, then the equal selection model says that trait could help explain why more men are incarcerated. They gathered data from 115 men in prison, 39 women in prison, 109 men from the general public, and 123 women from the general public. That is a pretty good sample size for the prison groups, especially for women. They focused on 6 traits that have been linked to crime. These included different aspects of psychopathy, which is often associated with a lack of empathy and impulsivity. They looked at meanness, which is about being callous, and disinhibition, which is about impulsivity and emotional outbursts. They also examined Machiavellianism, which is a manipulative personality style, and narcissistic entitlement, the belief that you deserve special treatment. Finally, they looked at guilt-proneness, the tendency to feel bad after doing something wrong, and something they called direction law overlap, which is how much your personal laws match the country's laws. Let's dive into what they found. For the equal selection model to hold up, all 3 conditions had to be met for a given trait. This was the first crack in the equal selection model. For disinhibition, they didn't find that men scored higher than women in the general population. This immediately means that even if disinhibition plays a role in incarceration, it can't explain why there is a gender gap to begin with, because the trait itself doesn't show a gender difference outside of prison. However, they did find that incarcerated men and women both scored higher on disinhibition than their civilian counterparts. This means disinhibition is linked to incarceration. So, while the incarcerated men and women didn't differ significantly in their levels of disinhibition, and they both were higher than the general population, the fact that there wasn't a general population gender difference meant this trait, despite showing equal selection, couldn't explain the overall gender gap in incarceration. It is a bit like having a tool that works the same for everyone, but the problem you're trying to solve only affects one group. Then they looked at meanness. Okay, so condition 1 met for meanness. Men in general scored higher. So prison inmates, both men and women, scored higher on meanness than people not in prison. Condition 2 met, but what about condition 3, the threshold equivalence? This is where it fell apart. They found that while incarcerated women scored higher on meanness than general population women, they scored much lower than incarcerated men. Essentially, women need to be less mean than men to end up in prison, meaning the selection line for meanness is different for women and men. So, meanness, despite having a gender gap in the population and an incarceration effect, didn't show equal selection. Condition 1 met. Condition 2 met, but again, threshold equivalence failed. While the women in prison scored higher than non-incarcerated women, they still scored lower than the men in prison. So, Machiavellianism also didn't show equal selection. Condition 1 met, but here is where it got complicated. This means that going to prison was linked with higher narcissistic entitlement in women, but not significantly in men. This breaks the second condition of the equal selection model. However, descriptively, the incarcerated women looked a lot like the incarcerated men, closer than they looked to the non-incarcerated women. This suggests equal selection, but it wasn't statistically significant, perhaps because the narcissistic entitlement scale they used with only 4 items wasn't very reliable. as the authors mentioned, this is the opposite of what the equal selection model would predict for a crime-related trait. If higher guilt proneness protects you from crime, then women having more of it should be less likely to be incarcerated. So people in prison, both men and women, scored lower on guilt proneness than people not in prison. This makes sense if guilt proneness is protective, but again, threshold equivalence failed. Incarcerated women were somewhere in the middle, not clearly resembling incarcerated men. Finally, direction law overlap H6. Just like with disinhibition, this trait didn't show a difference between men and women in the general population, meaning it can't explain the gender gap in incarceration. So people in prison had a lower overlap between their personal laws and society's laws, meaning they were less aligned with the legal system. But since there was no initial gender difference, this can't explain the gap. So no equal selection here either. So what is the overall story here? The researchers found very little support for their initial idea that incarceration selects men and women based on the same personality traits at the same levels. For disinhibition, they found equal selection, but there was no gender difference in the first place to explain. For most other traits like meanness and Machiavellianism, the selection threshold seemed to be different for men and women. That is, women needed to be less extreme on these traits to end up in prison compared to men. This is a pretty strong conclusion. The study suggests that the personality traits we often associate with crime, at least those they tested, don't seem to be the main drivers of the big difference in how many men and women are locked up. What does this mean? It suggests that the reasons for the gender gap in incarceration are likely more complex than just men having more bad personality traits. The authors propose that external factors might play a bigger role for women. They mention things like a higher history of victimization, substance dependence, and psychiatric problems in incarcerated women. It also seems that things like age and education had a more significant impact on female incarceration, suggesting that while personality might play a role, social and demographic factors can be just as, if not more, important, especially for women. If women were punished for being doubly deviant, you'd expect incarcerated women to look more like incarcerated men, and that wasn't the case here. This implies that we might need different explanations for why men and women offend, and why they end up incarcerated. Like any study, this one has its limits. While they try to get more incarcerated women, the number is still quite small, which can affect the results and make it harder to find significant differences. Also, because it is a cross-sectional study, they looked at people at one point in time. Personality can change during imprisonment, so it's hard to say if the traits led to incarceration or if being in prison changed their personality. They're not entirely sure if the personality test worked exactly the same way for everyone, especially comparing people in prison to people outside. This is a common challenge in this kind of research. So, to wrap it all up, the idea that personality traits explain the massive gender gap in who goes to prison wasn't strongly supported, while some traits were linked to incarceration. They either didn't show initial gender differences or selected people at different thresholds based on gender. This suggests we need to look beyond just personality, especially at social and environmental factors, to truly understand this persistent and puzzling difference. It's a reminder that human behavior, and especially crime and punishment, is rarely explained by just one thing. What do you think? Does this change how you view the reasons behind the incarceration gender gap? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to Rubin's Mind Lab for more science explained simply, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the human mind. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.